Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hey dear friends, let your body settle, let your breath grow slow and deep, and let the ancient hills of the Ozarks carry you into a place where time moves like water through stone. Tonight we're going to drift together into a very old part of the world, a place where the ground beneath your feet isn't quite what it seems, where the earth itself holds secrets that have been waiting longer than any human memory can reach. Close your eyes if you haven't already, feel the weight of your blankets, and let the story unfold like a slow, quiet river. There's a spot in the middle of America where the earth feels empty inside. Not the ordinary emptiness you find in limestone regions, where water has spent millions of years carving out natural caverns, but a different kind of hollow. This emptiness seems intentional, as if someone planned it. It makes geologists pause and choose their words carefully. It makes archaeologists shift the conversation to something else. It's a hollowness that the oldest families in those hills have quietly known about for generations, and they've mostly decided not to speak of it. The Ozark Plateau stretches across southern Missouri, northern Arkansas, and brushes against the edges of Oklahoma and Kansas. It stands as one of the most ancient exposed landforms on the entire North American continent. And hidden beneath it lies something that doesn't fit any of the stories we've been told about who lived here long before European ships ever arrived. Something the official records have never fully explained. Something that a small number of researchers, surveyors, and accidental discoverers have been trying to make sense of for more than 150 years, always without success. If you're listening to this to help you fall asleep, that's exactly the reason I create these stories. Maybe you could subscribe and let me know in your thoughts where you are right now and what time it is. Let's begin with the things everyone agrees on, because the disagreements will arrive quickly enough after that. The Ozarks are ancient, geologically old in a way that mountain ranges like the Rockies or the Sierra Nevada simply are not. Those western peaks came from relatively recent volcanic eruptions and tectonic collisions. But the Ozarks are the leftover remains of something that was already ancient when dinosaurs were still young. The bedrock underneath is Precambrian in some places, over 1 billion years old. The shape of the land above has been worn down by water for so long that the plateau looks almost gentle from a distance. Rolling hills, soft valleys, forested ridges, and clear rivers fed by springs. But underneath that calm surface hides an extraordinary maze of passages, rooms, and openings that geologists are still trying to map. Missouri alone holds more than 6,000 documented caves. Arkansas has thousands more. The Ozark region as a whole contains one of the highest concentrations of karst landscape on the planet. That's the technical term for ground shaped by the slow dissolving of soluble rock, mostly limestone and dolomite, as slightly acidic groundwater moves through it over eons. Karst terrain creates sinkholes, disappearing streams, springs that burst from cliffs with no visible source, and cave systems that can stretch for miles underground. All of this is well known. All of it has been carefully recorded. None of it is especially mysterious, at least not on the surface. But there is another layer beneath the geological one, and that's where the story begins to twist. Think for a moment about what it means to live on top of a landscape like that. The people who call the Ozarks home have always known that the ground under their feet isn't solid in the way that ground is supposed to be solid. There are places where you can hear water running somewhere beneath you when you walk across a field. There are sinkholes that open up overnight in a pasture that was smooth the day before. There are caves that breathe, pulling air in and pushing it out with the change in barometric pressure, as if the earth itself has lungs. This is the ordinary magic of karst country, and the people who live there learn to read it the way other people learn to read the weather. But the accounts we're talking about tonight describe something beyond that ordinary magic, something that doesn't just feel different from the surface world, but different from the underground world too. The first written hints of something strange under the Ozarks come from the early 1800s, found in the journals of European and American settlers who moved into the region after the Louisiana Purchase. These were practical souls, farmers and traders and surveyors, not prone to wild imaginings. And what they described wasn't the ordinary cave country that geology would have predicted. A surveyor named Josiah Gregg crossed the Ozarks in the 1830s and kept detailed notes on everything he saw. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote about a discovery that left him searching for words. He had climbed down into what looked like a natural cave entrance near the Current River in Missouri, following a local guide who had been born in those hills. But within the first 100 yards, the passage began to change. The usual limestone shapes, the stalactites, the flowstone, the uneven floor you'd expect in a karst cave, had turned into something else. The walls were smooth, not the kind of smoothness that water creates over a long time, with flowing curves and slow transitions, but the kind of smoothness that comes from being worked. Flat surfaces where there should have been rough patches. Right angles where the natural geology would never have produced them. Gregg wrote that he had no idea what to think. His guide, a man of Cherokee descent whose family had lived in the region for at least 3 generations, only said that the tunnels went far, that they had always been there, and that the old people never went inside them. Imagine being in that passage with Gregg, your lantern casting flickering shadows on those smooth walls, the silence pressing in around you except for the drip of water somewhere ahead. Imagine the feeling of standing in a place that shouldn't exist, a place that doesn't follow the rules you thought you understood. That feeling, that quiet unease mixed with wonder, runs through every account of these tunnels. It's the feeling of having crossed a line between the known and the unknown, between the world that makes sense and the world that doesn't. That phrase, "the old people did not go into them," shows up more than once in those early writings. It suggests that long before Europeans arrived, the native peoples of the Ozarks already knew about these passages and kept a deliberate distance. Not necessarily out of fear, or at least not only fear, but out of a kind of respectful avoidance, something different from ordinary superstition. The old people did not go into them implies that the old people understood something about what those passages were and chose not to get involved. So what were they? To try to answer that, you have to understand something about the human history of the Ozark Plateau that most Americans have never been taught. Because the Ozarks weren't a quiet, empty backwater before Europeans showed up. They were home to one of the most sophisticated and least understood cultures in pre-Columbian North America. Archaeologists call it the Ozark Bluff Dweller culture. It thrived in the region from roughly 500 BCE to 1300 CE, a span of nearly 2,000 years. The bluff dwellers built their homes in natural rock shelters and overhangs along the Ozark cliffs, stone-floored alcoves that offered protection from weather and enemies. They were skilled farmers, hunters, and crafters. They left behind an incredibly rich material culture, baskets so tightly woven they could hold water, fabrics made from plant fibers and animal hair, pottery decorated with intricate geometric patterns, and stone tools from quarries hundreds of miles away, pointing to long-distance trade networks that historians usually associate with cultures much farther east and south. Think about the skill required to weave a basket that can hold water. That's not simple craftsmanship. That's an understanding of materials, of tension, of the way plant fibers behave when they're wet and when they're dry, that comes from generations of experimentation and refinement. The bluff dwellers weren't primitive. They were experts in their world in ways that we're only beginning to appreciate. And they shared that world with something else, something beneath their feet. But the bluff dwellers aren't the oldest culture in the Ozarks, not by a long shot. Beneath their sites, archaeologists have found evidence of human presence going back 10,000 years, to the very end of the last ice age, when the Ozark Plateau sat at the edge of a completely different world. A world of spruce forests, massive animals like mastodons, and people making their first permanent homes on the continent. The Ozarks, it seems, were one of the first places in the interior where humans put down roots and stayed. And they stayed because the region offered something rare and precious, dependable water. The springs of the Ozarks are among the most powerful in the world. Big Spring in Missouri releases enough water every day to supply a small city. Mammoth Spring in Arkansas pours forth so much that it ranks as one of the largest springs in the American South. These springs rise from the same underground aquifer that fills the tunnels and passages beneath the plateau. and they've been flowing without pause for thousands of years. People followed the water. People always follow the water. So now you have 10,000 years of continuous human occupation on a landscape dotted with natural caves. And somewhere in those 10,000 years, something happened that left a mark on the underground world that no one has ever been able to fully explain. The first serious look into these strange tunnel systems came in the 1870s from a physician and amateur archaeologist named Thaddeus Moore. He spent several summers exploring caves along the Current River and 11-point river drainages in Missouri. Moore was methodical. He sketched and described every cave he entered. And what he found in about a dozen locations across a 2-county area formed a pattern, not just random oddities. At each spot, a natural cave entrance, often partly hidden by plants or fallen rocks, led into a passage that started with the expected irregular limestone shapes, dripping stalactites, uneven floors, the damp smell of bat colonies, and rotting leaves. But at some point, in some caves as close as 50 feet from the entrance, in others several hundred feet in, the passage would change. The floor would level out. The walls would straighten. The ceiling, which in a natural cave follows the uneven lines of dissolved fractures, would become more uniform, sometimes showing what Moore called tool marks, parallel scratches on the stone that he couldn't explain by any natural process he knew. In 2 of the caves, he found something even more surprising, junctions where 2 passages met at an angle, shaped in a way that suggested deliberate construction. At one junction, he noted that the angle was roughly 90 degrees, a right angle held with such precision that, as he wrote in his notes, even modern surveying tools would have struggled to match it. Moore sent his sketches and observations to the Smithsonian Institution. He received a polite letter acknowledging receipt. He never heard from them again. Picture Moore sitting in his study by lamplight, drawing those right angles, trying to make sense of what he'd seen. Picture the frustration of sending your best work into the void and getting back nothing but silence. That silence, that institutional shrug, has been the response to the Ozark tunnels for 150 years. And yet the reports kept coming. This pattern isn't unusual in the history of odd archaeological discoveries in North America, and it's worth pausing over because it runs through the whole story of the Ozark tunnels. Not just the tunnels themselves, but how institutions have responded to them. The late 1800s were a busy time for American archaeology, much of it organized around a particular idea that historians of science now call the mound builder myth. When European settlers first came across the huge earthen mounds of the Mississippi and Ohio valleys, most educated Americans assumed those structures couldn't have been built by the ancestors of the native people still living on the land. The indigenous nations were considered, in the thinking of that time, too primitive, too disorganized, too lacking in culture to have built those enormous burial mounds, effigy mounds, and temple platforms stretching from Wisconsin to Louisiana. So someone else must have built them, the reasoning went. A lost race of superior beings, maybe Welshmen or Vikings, or one of the lost tribes of Israel, or even survivors of Atlantis. People who had lived in North America in some distant past, and then vanished, leaving only their earthworks behind. This myth was comforting to European Americans for obvious reasons. It meant the land had been home to a superior civilization that had already disappeared before today's native peoples arrived, which meant those native peoples had no deep historical claim to the land, which made taking it from them less of a moral problem, just the continuation of an old pattern. The mound builder myth was as much about ideology as archaeology, and it shaped how institutions responded to strange discoveries for decades. The Smithsonian, under leaders like John Wesley Powell, spent a lot of effort debunking that myth, which was real science and produced real results, showing that the mounds were indeed built by the ancestors of living native peoples. But that debunking had an unintended side effect. In its rush to dismiss romantic and racist ideas about lost superior races, institutional archaeology became reflexively dismissive of any evidence pointing to surprising cultural sophistication in pre-Columbian North America. Anything that didn't fit the slow, steady story of gradual native development was suspicious, Not because the evidence was examined and found weak, but because the shape of the evidence felt too uncomfortable to take seriously. That's the background for why Thaddeus Moore's notes disappeared into the Smithsonian archives and were never published. But the tunnels kept being found. In 1893, a farmer named Elias Rutherford was working on his land near the town of Alton in Oregon County, Missouri, when he broke through the floor of his root cellar into a passage he'd never known existed. The passage ran, as best he could measure, due north and due south from where he entered, with walls he described in a letter to the local newspaper as smooth as planed wood, showing cutting marks. Rutherford lowered himself in with a lantern and followed the passage south for about 300 yards before the ceiling got too low to continue. He followed it north a shorter distance until he hit a partial collapse he didn't want to risk crossing. He told the county surveyor, who came out, looked around, and wrote in his official report that the passage appeared to be man-made. But he couldn't tell how old it was or what it was for, and that any further study would need more resources than the county could provide. The local paper ran a short story. A few people came to see it, and then nothing. Rutherford, a practical farmer with work to do, mortared over the hole in his cellar floor and went back to his life. The passage under his farm had been there for thousands of years. It could wait a bit longer. Imagine that moment, standing in your own root cellar with a hole in the floor leading down into darkness that might go anywhere. Imagine the choice to close it up and go back to your chores. That's not ignorance. That's a different kind of wisdom. The wisdom of a person who knows that some questions are better left unasked, at least for now. The Ozarks are full of that kind of practical silence. What makes the Ozark tunnel accounts so striking, and what separates them from ordinary cave folklore, is their consistency. When you look at them across time and across different places, certain details appear again and again, reported by people who had no connection to each other, often not even knowing that others had seen the same things. The smooth walls show up in almost every account. Not the glossy surfaces of flowstone, but a different kind of smoothness, one that preserves faint hints of the tools or methods that made it. Parallel scratches, occasional flat surfaces breaking the natural curves of the rock, places that reflect lantern light differently than the untouched stone around them. The right angles appear often. Natural caves don't form right angles. They follow the lines of cracks and fractures in the bedrock, which are created by tectonic forces and are always irregular and curved. When a natural cave seems to have a right-angled corner, it's almost always a trick of light or angle or rock formations. The right angles described in the Ozark accounts are consistent and measurable, not illusions. The junction points appear in enough reports to suggest the passages aren't isolated oddities, but parts of a larger system. A north-south tunnel meets an east-west tunnel. A main passage branches into two smaller ones at equal angles. These aren't natural cave patterns. These are patterns of plan construction. And then there's the size. The passages described range from about 4 feet to over 8 feet in height, and from about 3 feet to maybe 10 or 12 feet wide. Those are human-scale dimensions, size for people walking through them, not for water moving under pressure. Natural solution caves in limestone are shaped by the amount and speed of the water that dissolve them, and they tend to be either much larger than human scale, formed by large volumes of slow water, or much smaller, formed by small volumes of fast water forced through tight cracks. The Ozark tunnel dimensions consistently fall into the range of passages built for human use. In the early 1900s, a new kind of explorer began taking interest in the Ozark tunnels. These weren't academics or surveyors, but cavers, enthusiastic amateurs, and later semi-professionals who started systematically exploring American cave systems for the first time. Organized caving is mostly a 20th century thing. Before reliable electric lights and standardized ropes and climbing gear, exploring beyond lantern light was genuinely dangerous in ways that made serious study nearly impossible. But by the 1920s and 1930s, caving clubs were forming in the Ozarks, drawn by the incredible number of cave entrances and the chance to map untouched passages. These early cavers cared mainly about natural formations, geology, biology, and the sheer thrill of being underground. But they were observant people and several of them noticed and wrote down the same odd features that earlier investigators had reported. A caver named Raymond Dobbins explored extensively in Shannon County, Missouri, in the late 1930s and early 1940s. He kept a journal that was later given to the Missouri Speleological Survey. In it, he described at least 4 separate cave systems where he saw what he called worked sections, passages where the natural cave gradually turned into what looked like deliberate excavation. He noted that the transitions were remarkably consistent. The natural cave would go on for a while, and then there would be a shift, almost a feeling of crossing a threshold from one kind of place into another. The walls would tighten and become more regular. The floor would level. The ceiling would drop to a more uniform height. And if you looked closely at the walls, you could see the marks. Dobbins tried to interest the Missouri Geological Survey in his observations. They told him he was probably misinterpreting natural cave features, which was possible since he wasn't a trained geologist. But he was trained in close observation of underground spaces, having spent years in them. And he believed for the rest of his life that what he'd seen in those 4 caves was not natural. Think about Dobbins crawling through those passages, his carbide lamp hissing, the smell of limestone dust and damp earth, the feeling of his hand running along a wall that was too smooth, too straight, too deliberate. He knew what natural cave looked like. He'd spent hundreds of hours in natural caves. And this was different. That difference stayed with him. The question of who made the tunnels, if they were made, tends to take over the conversation because it's the most dramatic question, the most fun to argue about. But it might not be the most important one. The more basic question is whether the tunnels exist as described. And if they do, what the physical evidence can tell us about when and how they were made, leaving the who for later. On the question of physical evidence, the most interesting work was done in the 1960s and 1970s by a geologist named Harold Thorne. He spent part of his career with the Missouri Department of Natural Resources and the rest pursuing what his colleagues considered an odd obsession with the strange passages of Ozark caves. Thorne was careful to separate what he could prove from what he was guessing. What he could prove, based on direct examination of surface samples from several passages, was that in certain places the wall surfaces showed a degree of smoothness that didn't match normal cave formation processes in Ozark limestone. The smoothness wasn't from water erosion, which leaves scallop patterns. It wasn't from frost action, which leaves angular fragments. It wasn't from sediment-laden water rubbing against the rock, which leaves horizontal bands. What it looked like to Thorne's eye and under his hand lens was the result of repeated, directed contact with a hard object, not chipping or pounding, which would leave pits, but a kind of sustained grinding or abrasion that had removed surface irregularities and created a relatively flat, relatively uniform surface that preserved faint linear marks and consistent orientations. Thorne collected samples and had them analyzed by colleagues at the University of Missouri. The analysis confirmed that the surface texture was unusual compared to normal cave formation. It didn't confirm human origin. It just said the texture was unusual and left it at that. Thorne published a paper in a regional geology journal suggesting the unusual surfaces deserved more study. His colleagues received it with polite indifference. He retired from the State Department in 1979 and spent several more years trying to interest academic researchers in his findings before he died in 1987. His field notes and sample analyses are on file with the Missouri Geological Survey, where they've sat largely unread ever since. There's something poignant about Thorne's story, isn't there? A man who spent his career doing ordinary geology and his retirement chasing something he couldn't prove but couldn't let go of. He knew what he'd seen. He had the samples to prove it, but he couldn't get anyone to look at them seriously. That's the loneliness of the anomalous, the isolation of finding something that doesn't fit and having no one to share it with. There's another track to the investigation of the Ozark tunnels, and that's the native oral tradition, which is both richer and more complex than the scientific record and much harder to interpret. The Osage Nation, whose traditional lands centered on the Ozark Plateau and surrounding areas, has a body of oral tradition about the Ozark landscape that goes back long before European contact. The Osage weren't the original inhabitants of the Ozarks, at least according to their own stories. Their oral history says that when the Osage came to the Ozark region, they found it already occupied by a people they called the Little Ones, a term that has sometimes been translated as referring to small physical size, and sometimes as the diminished remains of a once greater people. The Little Ones, according to Osage tradition, were already ancient when the Osage arrived. They were connected to the underground world, to caves and springs and the passages beneath the earth, in ways that suggested more than ordinary familiarity. They knew the underground landscape the way a people knows a place they've lived for a very long time. The Osage tradition doesn't explicitly say the Little Ones built the tunnels, but it connects them to the underground world in a way that implies a relationship of creation, or at least of dwelling that goes beyond simple cave living. The Little Ones are described as being of the earth in a way that the Osage themselves were not. They were tied to the underground landscape spiritually and practically, making them something other than ordinary people living in ordinary places. Imagine the weight of that tradition, carried across generations in stories told by firelight, in the winter when the nights were long and the old ones had time to talk. Imagine being a child hearing about the Little Ones for the first time, feeling the presence of something old and powerful beneath the hills where you played. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from books. It comes from the land itself, passed from hand to hand, from voice to ear for thousands of years. Similar traditions exist among other peoples connected to the Ozark region. The Quapaw, whose territory lay just to the south and east of the Osage, have stories about the inside of the earth, describing passages and chambers inhabited by beings who are neither fully human nor fully spirit, but something in between. The Cherokee, who moved through the Ozarks in large numbers during the colonial and early American periods, brought with them traditions from their original southeastern homeland that included references to underground people and underground passages. Some researchers have suggested those traditions may have come from actual encounters with evidence of the tunnels. The problem with oral tradition as evidence is obvious. Stories change over time. They gain symbolic layers and lose literal facts. The underground world is one of the most universal metaphors in human culture. Untangling the metaphorical from the possibly historical in any given tradition takes great care and deep cultural knowledge, which is rare. But the consistency of the Ozark traditions across different cultural groups and the specificity of some of their details makes them hard to dismiss entirely. There's also the matter of artifacts. Over the last 150 years, a number of objects have been recovered from or near Ozark cave systems that don't fit neatly into the established archaeological sequence for the area. The word artifacts is used loosely here because some of these objects are archaeological in the strict sense, recovered from documented contexts with clear provenience, while others are more dubious. Things that turned up in antique shops or private collections or local museums without clear documentation of where they came from. But some are well documented, and they are strange. In 1933, during road construction in Taney County, Missouri, workers blasting through a rock outcrop opened a natural void that turned out to be a small cave chamber about 20 feet across and 10 feet high. The chamber had been sealed off from its original entrance at some point in the past. Inside, investigators from the University of Missouri found a collection of objects that had been deliberately placed there. There were ceramic pots in a style unlike anything in the Ozark archaeological sequence, decorated with symbols more similar to pottery traditions from much farther south, from the lower Mississippi Valley or even Mesoamerica. There were stone objects, including several that looked like weights or plummets, precisely shaped from dense stone with drilled holes of the type used in sophisticated measuring or weaving. There were bone tools and a quantity of plant fiber material that later analysis identified as cotton, a crop not cultivated in the Ozarks in any known farming tradition. The University of Missouri team documented the discovery carefully and published a preliminary report in 1934. The report raised more questions than answers and attracted a lot of attention from the archaeological community, some interested, some skeptical. Then the chamber's contents were sent to the Smithsonian for further study, and the story goes quiet. The Smithsonian's record from that period aren't fully digitized, and the collection hasn't, as far as any current researcher knows, ever been the subject of a published analysis. Picture those objects sitting in a drawer somewhere in a Smithsonian storage facility, unseen for 90 years. Pots with strange symbols. Stone weights carved with a precision that speaks of lost skills. Cotton that shouldn't be there. They're waiting too, just like the tunnels. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. There's a pattern here worth noticing. It's not a conspiracy, or at least there's no evidence it's a conspiracy. It's more likely the ordinary chaos of an overworked institution handling more material than it can possibly study, combined with a certain lack of urgency about findings that complicate the accepted story. But the pattern is real. Strange discoveries in the Ozarks are made, documented, reported, sent to larger institutions, and then they vanish into archives. They don't get explained. They don't get debunked. They just stop being talked about. Let's talk about what mainstream Ozark archaeology actually does know, because understanding the known context helps explain why the unknown is so hard to account for. The Ozark region has been continuously inhabited for at least 10,000 years, probably longer. The oldest evidence comes from cave sites where stone tools have been found in layers dating to the period right after the last ice age, when the climate of interior North America was very different from today. Back then, the Ozark Plateau sat at the edge of a boreal forest zone, and the people living there hunted animals that no longer exist in the region, including mastodons and giant ground sloths. Over the following thousands of years, as the climate warmed and the landscape changed, the human cultures of the Ozarks changed with it. The archaeological record shows a clear sequence of distinct cultural phases, each with its own tool technologies, settlement patterns, and artistic traditions, stretching from the Archaic period through the Woodland period and into the Mississippian and late prehistoric periods just before European contact. What mainstream archaeology shows, and this is important, is that the Ozark region was connected to much wider cultural networks throughout its history. Materials found in Ozark sites include copper from the Great Lakes, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, chert from quarries in Illinois and Indiana, and in later periods, pottery and other objects showing strong stylistic links to the great Mississippian civilization centered at Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis. The Ozarks weren't an isolated backwater. They were part of a continental web of exchange and cultural influence stretching from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic to the Rockies. This established context makes the tunnels more interesting, not less. Because if the Ozarks were connected to one of the most sophisticated cultural complexes in pre-Columbian North America, then the possibility that they contain evidence of sophisticated cultural activity we haven't properly accounted for isn't as surprising as it might seem. The question isn't whether pre-Columbian Ozark people were capable of impressive cultural achievements. The established archaeology shows beyond doubt that they were. The question is what specific form those achievements took, and whether any of them involved building underground passages. There are several theories about the origin and purpose of the tunnels, and it's worth laying them out honestly, including their strengths and weaknesses. The first and most conservative theory is that what people have described as artificial tunnel construction is actually a misinterpretation of natural cave features. Limestone caves can produce formations that look surprisingly regular to an untrained eye. Bat droppings can smooth cave floors. Flowstone can level uneven surfaces. Wind and water over very long periods can create wall surfaces that look worked when they aren't. This theory has the advantage of requiring no extraordinary explanation, but it has the disadvantage of not accounting for all the described features. Right-angle junctions are especially hard to produce by natural cave-forming processes, and the consistency of the reported features across many independent observers and many cave systems argues against simple misinterpretation. The second theory is that the tunnels are remnants of prehistoric mining. The Ozarks have been a source of galena, the main ore of lead, and other minerals since prehistoric times. Galena was an important trade item throughout the Mississippian period, used as pigment in pottery and as body paint in rituals. It's well established that native peoples mined galena from surface outcrops and from shallow underground workings in the Ozarks. The theory suggests that what have been interpreted as tunnels are actually prehistoric mining galleries, which would explain the worked surfaces, the human-scale dimensions, and the deliberate character of the passages. This theory is more compelling than the first, but it still has problems. Mining galleries tend to have a very specific character, branching and connecting in ways that follow or deposits, not maintaining consistent directions and grades. The passages described in the Ozark accounts follow consistent compass orientations and relatively level grades, more like transportation routes than extraction tunnels. And while galena mining could explain some passages in some locations, it doesn't explain passages in areas with no known or deposits. The third theory, the one the mainstream archaeological establishment finds most uncomfortable and has therefore spent the least time engaging with, is that the tunnels are parts of a deliberately built underground network constructed by a culture or cultures we haven't yet properly identified, for purposes that might have included transportation, storage, ritual use, or some combination of all three. This theory would require that people living in the Ozarks at some point in the pre-Columbian era had both the motivation and the technical ability to excavate passages through solid limestone at a scale far beyond anything previously attributed to any culture in interior North America. That's a significant requirement, but it's not, given what we know about the sophistication of the Mississippian complex and its predecessors, an impossible one. The construction of Monk's Mound at Cahokia, the largest pre-Columbian earthwork in North America, required moving about 50 million cubic feet of earth by hand over several centuries using only wooden and stone tools. If people could do that above ground, there's no inherent reason they couldn't have done something comparable below ground. In 1968, a caver named Margaret Forsythe was exploring a cave system in Ozark County, Arkansas, when she pushed into a previously unexplored section of a known cave and emerged into a passage unlike anything she'd seen in decades of caving. She was an experienced caver trained as a physical geographer, and she knew what she was looking at. The passage was about 6 feet high and 5 feet wide, with walls showing clear marks of repeated tool contact in parallel horizontal bands. The floor was level, artificially leveled, smooth, and in places covered with a thin layer of what she later identified as tamped clay. The ceiling was irregular, natural limestone with ordinary dissolved irregularities, but the walls and floor had clearly been modified. She followed the passage for about 400 feet before her rope ran out and caution made her turn back. She estimated the passage continued beyond that point. She took photos, collected surface samples, made detailed sketches, and spent hours documenting everything. When she came out, she reported her discovery to the Arkansas Archaeological Survey, which was then conducting a systematic survey of archaeological sites across the state. A survey representative visited the cave with her on a later trip and confirmed her observations. A brief note was made in the survey's records. No follow-up investigation was conducted. Forsythe spent the next several years trying to get the passage properly studied. She wrote letters, attended conferences, contacted geology and archaeology departments at several universities. She was consistently told that her observations were interesting, but that resources for a proper investigation weren't available and the site wasn't considered a priority. She died in 1989. The passage she found is still there. Picture Margaret Forsythe, in her 60s by then, still trying to get someone to listen, still writing letters, still hoping that this time, someone would take her seriously. She knew what she'd found. She'd spent her whole life learning to read the underground landscape, and she couldn't get anyone to look. That's the tragedy of the Ozark tunnels. Not just that they're unexplained, but that the people who tried to explain them were dismissed, forgotten, left to carry their knowledge to the grave alone. It would be easy, reading through these accounts, to conclude that the explanation for the Ozark tunnels is simple institutional neglect, that the tunnels exist as described, that they're clearly anomalous, and that nobody has properly investigated them because the question of who built them and why is too uncomfortable for the established archaeological framework. That conclusion might even be partly correct, but it's not the whole story, because the full story requires grappling with something more difficult than institutional neglect. It requires grappling with the possibility that the tunnels aren't a single phenomenon with a single explanation. The Ozark Plateau is a very large area, and the account of anomalous passages span more than a century and a half, from the early 1800s to today. In all that time, no single investigator has managed to document a continuous tunnel network. The accounts describe passages, sometimes long ones, but always finite, always ending in a collapse or a water-filled section or a ceiling drop that prevents further exploration. No one has walked from one end of an Ozark tunnel to the other and come out the other side. No one has produced a map connecting the various reported passages into a coherent system. This could mean several things. It could mean the passages aren't connected, that they're isolated sections of artificial construction rather than a continuous network, perhaps built at different times for different purposes by different cultures. It could mean the passages are connected, but the connecting sections have been destroyed by collapses or filled with sediment over the centuries and millennia since they were built. It could mean the passages are connected, but the connecting sections are still unexplored, submerged by groundwater, or sealed by rockfalls no investigator has yet managed to pass. Or it could mean the tunnel network isn't a network at all in the way we imagine it. Not a set of corridors connecting point A to point B like roads or railroads, but something with a different logic, a different spatial organization built according to principles that don't easily translate into our ideas about transportation infrastructure. This last possibility is the most interesting and the hardest to engage with, because it requires the investigator to set aside the assumption that the people who built the tunnels, if they were built, were trying to do the same kinds of things we do when we build underground passages. What if they weren't? What if the purposes of the tunnels weren't practical in the ordinary sense? Not about moving people or goods from one place to another, but about something else entirely. In many Native American traditions, the underground world isn't simply the literal world beneath the Earth's surface. It's a different kind of world, with its own inhabitants, its own rules, and its own relationship to the world above. The connection between the surface and the underground is mediated by specific places, caves and springs and sinkholes where the boundary between the two is thin enough to cross. The people who know how to use those places, who have been trained in the protocols for crossing that boundary safely, hold a special role in their communities. They're the ones who maintain the relationship between the living world and the other world, between the ordinary and the sacred, between the visible and the invisible. In this framework, a tunnel connecting two cave openings isn't just a passageway. It's a traversal of the underground world with all the spiritual meaning that implies. The act of moving through the tunnel isn't just travel. It's a kind of ritual passage through a liminal space, a crossing from one kind of existence to another and back again. The smooth walls and level floors aren't just evidence of construction technique. They're evidence of deliberate shaping of sacred space, a preparation of the ritual environment in the same way a ceremonial structure on the surface would be prepared. This interpretation can't be proven. It may not be correct, but it's consistent with the oral traditions of the peoples with the deepest historical ties to the Ozark landscape. And it offers an explanation for some features of the tunnels that the more purely practical theories don't account for. Why? For instance, would the tunnels maintain such consistent compass orientations if they were simply mining galleries or transportation routes? A transportation route follows the path of least resistance, adapting to the terrain. A passage deliberately oriented to a compass direction, maintained at significant extra effort, suggests that the direction itself matters, that something about north or south or east or west is meaningful to the structure's purpose. Consistent compass orientation appears in many accounts. The North-South Passage under Elias Rutherford's farm. The consistently oriented passages noted by Raymond Dobbins. The passage explored by Margaret Forsyth, which she described as running on a bearing she estimated at about 15 degrees east of true north. A bearing that corresponds to a direction with astronomical significance in several pre-Columbian traditions, marking the rising point of a specific star or constellation at a specific time of year. These details may be coincidental, But coincidence becomes less satisfying as an explanation the more you look. One of the researchers who has spent the most sustained time on the Ozark tunnel question in recent decades is a retired engineer named Dale Hoffman. He began his investigation not as a scholar or archaeologist, but as a caver exploring southern Missouri's cave systems as a hobby for most of his adult life. Hoffman isn't a credentialed researcher in any of the relevant fields, and he's scrupulous about saying so. He doesn't claim to know what the tunnels are or who built them. What he claims, based on several decades of direct observation, is that there are passages in the Ozark cave systems that can't be adequately explained by current geological or archaeological models, and that those passages deserve more rigorous investigation than they've received. Hoffman has documented, by his own count, over 40 separate locations across a 4-county area of Missouri where he has observed anomalous passages. Not all are equally convincing. Some could plausibly be explained by natural processes acting over very long periods. But a core group of about 15 locations, spread across the area in a pattern he has mapped that shows something very close to geometric regularity, contain features he can't explain in natural terms. The geometric regularity of the distribution is perhaps the most striking feature of Hoffman's work, because it's the kind of observation a non-geologist might make and a geologist would be expected to dismiss as wishful pattern matching. And yet, when you look at the map he has produced, something about it is difficult to ignore. The locations form a pattern that isn't random. They're spaced at intervals too regular to be purely coincidental. They're arranged along lines that correspond to known geological features of the plateau, the major fracture zones and joint systems in the bedrock, but arranged along those lines in a way that suggests selection rather than simple geology. If someone built a tunnel system through the Ozarks, they would have chosen to excavate along the natural fractures and weak zones because that's where the rock is easiest to work. The geological structure of the plateau would have served as a guide, a pre-existing map of where excavation was easiest. Hoffman's observation that the anomalous passages cluster along the major fracture zones is therefore not just consistent with a natural explanation. It's also consistent with planned construction that used the natural geology as its guide. There are stories in the Ozark Hills, passed down through generations and families that have been in the region since before the Civil War, about passages that lead to places where the ordinary rules of the world don't apply. These aren't just ghost stories, though the hills have those too. These are something different, accounts of physical places with physical characteristics specific and consistent enough to suggest they're describing something real. An old woman in Shannon County, Missouri, interviewed by a local historian in the 1970s as part of an oral history project, told a story she'd heard from her grandmother, who had heard it from her grandmother before that, which would place the original account somewhere in the early 1800s. The story described a passage beneath a particular ridge that led, after a long walk in the dark, to a large underground chamber where the air was warm and still and smelled of old stone and old water. In that chamber, her ancestor had found stone seats arranged in a circle around a central depression in the floor, as if a fire had burned there, though there was no ash or char on the stone. The walls of the chamber were marked with figures she couldn't read, not painted but incised, cut into the stone in lines that caught the lantern light. Her ancestor had turned back without exploring further, spooked by the silence and the feeling that the chamber was a place with a purpose she wasn't part of. She never went back. She didn't tell many people about it, but the story stayed in the family, passed down through the women specifically as something to remember, even if no one knew exactly what it meant. This kind of account is maddening to a researcher because it's specific enough to be compelling and vague enough to be useless as evidence. Where's the ridge? Where's the entrance? The old woman didn't know, or said she didn't know, and the original encounter was several generations removed by the time the story reached her. The location had been lost with the people who knew it. But the description of the chamber, the stone seats in a circle, the central depression, the incised figures on the walls, appears in more than one account from different parts of the Ozarks, from people with no connection to each other and no reason to tell the same story. It appears in the journal of a missionary named Solomon Thayer who traveled through the Ozarks in the 1820s and recorded an account given to him by a trapper who claimed to have entered such a chamber in Arkansas. It appears in a newspaper article from the 1890s describing the discovery of a chamber in Missouri. It appears in the oral history interviews of the 1970s. The consistency of the description across time and source suggests the accounts are describing a real place, or a real type of place, that exists or existed in the cave systems of the Ozarks. The stone seats in a circle are a detail specific enough to be meaningful. Circular seating arrangements oriented around a central point are characteristic of deliberate ceremonial construction in many cultural traditions. They aren't features that would arise spontaneously in a natural cave, and they aren't the kind of detail storytellers invent independently and consistently. Details like that stick because they're real, or because they describe something real that the storyteller encountered or was told about with enough vividness to fix the specific image in memory. Imagine that chamber. Imagine the circle of stone seats, worn smooth by generations of use. Imagine the central depression where the fire once burned, now cold for centuries. Imagine the walls covered in symbols that no one living can read, cut into the rock with a patience and skill that speaks of deep meaning. And imagine the silence, the absolute silence of a place that hasn't heard a human voice in 1,000 years. That's what's waiting under the Ozarks. That's what the old stories are trying to tell us. There's a layer of this story we haven't yet touched, and it's the layer most likely to provoke dismissal, which is why it's been saved for this point. After all the geological evidence, the historical accounts, and the oral traditions, that layer is the question of what the tunnels have been used for in more recent history. There is solid documentary evidence that some Ozark cave systems have been used for purposes other than recreation and scientific investigation since at least the Civil War. The Ozarks during the Civil War were a deeply contested region, home to partisan warfare of an intensity that made the more organized campaigns in the East look formal by comparison. Both Union and Confederate irregular forces used the Ozark caves as hiding places, supply caches, and refuges. So did the many bands of independent raiders who fought for neither side, using the chaos to settle old scores and pursue private goals. So did ordinary civilians trying to survive in a landscape where armed men of unknown loyalty might appear at any time. The cave systems of the Ozarks were, in other words, already known to be extensive and complex enough to hide people and goods from parties actively searching for them. That knowledge didn't appear from nowhere in 1861. It was already part of the landscape's cultural character, built up over generations of occupation by people who had learned what the hills and hollows and the passages beneath them could conceal. After the Civil War, that same knowledge served other purposes. The Ozark Hill country became, during Prohibition, one of the centers of illegal alcohol production in the American interior. The region's isolation and the density of its cave systems made it ideal for hiding stills and storage. Local tradition in the Ozarks is emphatic that some of the most productive still operations of that era were located not in outbuildings or barns, but underground, in sections of cave systems accessed through entrances known to the operators and hidden from everyone else. None of this directly bears on the question of pre-Columbian tunnel construction, but it speaks to the character of the landscape and the people who have lived in it. The way the underground geography of the Ozarks has functioned as a resource for concealment, privacy, and activities outside official knowledge for as long as anyone has been paying attention. That character isn't incidental to the story of the tunnels. It's part of why the tunnels have been so persistently and effectively ignored. Think about what it means to live in a place where the ground itself offers hiding places. Think about the kind of people who would choose to settle there generation after generation. People who valued privacy and self-reliance and the ability to disappear if they needed to. The Ozarks have always attracted that kind of people, and that kind of people don't tend to report their discoveries to the authorities. They don't call the university when they find something strange in a cave. They keep it to themselves, or they tell only their children, and the knowledge stays in the family, underground in its own way, waiting for a different kind of attention. When you try to organize all of this into something coherent, what you're left with isn't a tidy answer, but a set of questions that are clearer than they were at the beginning. Is there physical evidence, observed by multiple independent witnesses over more than a century and a half, of passages in Ozark cave systems that appear to have been artificially modified or constructed? Yes, the evidence isn't conclusive, but it's substantial, and it's been documented by observers with a range of backgrounds and expertise, from untrained farmers to experienced cavers to professional geologists. Does the native oral tradition of the Ozarks contain accounts consistent with the existence of constructed underground passages and chambers? Yes. The traditions of the Osage and related peoples contain specific references to underground spaces with characteristics that go beyond ordinary cave dwelling. And those traditions are consistent in certain key details with the physical descriptions in the historical accounts. Have the anomalous passages been adequately investigated by the academic establishment? No. The pattern of discovery, documentation, institutional referral, and subsequent neglect is too consistent across too many decades to be attributed entirely to coincidence or simple resource limitations. Something about the question of the Ozark tunnels has made the institutions responsible for answering it consistently reluctant to engage. Why? This is the question that doesn't have a clean answer, and that's partly why the story keeps being told in the margins rather than in the textbooks. The most cynical reading of the institutional neglect is that the tunnels present evidence of a level of pre-Columbian cultural sophistication in interior North America that doesn't fit the established historical narrative, and that the established narrative is invested in by the institutions that would be responsible for revising it. This reading isn't entirely wrong. The history of American archaeology is full of examples of anomalous discoveries that were marginalized because they complicated the dominant story. But the most cynical reading isn't the only reading. It's also possible that the anomalous passages have been neglected partly because they're genuinely difficult to investigate, located in remote areas, requiring significant resources and technical expertise, and producing evidence ambiguous enough to justify the caution of trained scientists who are rightly reluctant to make dramatic claims on the basis of surface observations and oral tradition. The truth is probably somewhere in the complicated middle space between those two readings, as truth usually is. There's one more piece of this story that needs to be told, and it's a recent piece, which makes it different in character from everything else we've covered. In the past decade, the tools available for investigating the underground landscape of the Ozarks have improved dramatically. Ground-penetrating radar, LiDAR mapping from aerial platforms, three-dimensional photogrammetry of cave surfaces, isotope analysis of mineral deposits, radiocarbon dating of organic materials found in cave contexts. These technologies have transformed what's possible in the investigation of cave systems and underground voids in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to researchers 30 years ago. Some of this technology has been applied to Ozark cave systems in the context of ordinary geological and hydrological research, and the results have been, to say the least, interesting. A ground-penetrating radar survey conducted as part of a hydrological study in Shannon County, Missouri, in 2017 was intended to map the extent of a known cave system to understand its relationship to local groundwater flow. The survey produced the expected results in some areas, mapping known cave passages and confirming models of local hydrogeology. But in one section of the survey area, the results were unexpected. The radar returns showed void spaces beneath the surface that weren't consistent with the expected cave formation pattern. They were too regular, too rectangular, too consistently oriented. The researchers who conducted the survey noted the anomalous returns in their report and attributed them, with appropriate scientific caution, to data artifacts or possible geological features not accounted for in their model. They recommended further investigation. The recommendation hasn't yet been acted upon. A LiDAR survey of the same general region, conducted in 2019 as part of a statewide mapping project, showed something in the surface topography that wasn't expected. A series of subtle linear depressions visible in the high-resolution elevation data that LiDAR produces, but not apparent to the naked eye walking the landscape. These depressions followed orientations and spacings consistent with the locations of subsurface voids inferred from the radar survey. Linear surface depressions of this kind are sometimes associated with the gradual collapse of underground passages as sealing material loses integrity over time. Neither of these findings has been published in a form accessible to the general reader. They exist in technical reports filed with the agencies that commission the surveys. They aren't secret. They're just not publicized, which in the current media environment amounts to the same thing. Think about what those radar returns mean. Somewhere under those Missouri hills, there are voids that shouldn't be there, voids that are too regular, too rectangular, too deliberately shaped to be natural. The machines don't lie. The data is there, sitting in a file on someone's computer, waiting for someone to look at it and say, "What is this?" That's the state of the Ozark tunnels in the 21st century. Not disproven, not explained, just sitting there in the data, waiting. This is where we are at the end of a story that doesn't have an ending. Beneath the Ozark Plateau, something is waiting. Something that was made or modified or used by people who lived in the American interior long before the written record begins, for purposes we're only beginning to understand. Something the native traditions of the region have remembered and kept alive through generations of storytelling without any institutional support for that memory. Something independent investigators have documented at personal cost and with professional risk across nearly 2 centuries without ever receiving the validation that would have allowed the inquiry to become systematic. The tunnels aren't the only mystery of the Ozarks. They aren't even the most spectacular mystery of a region that has been generating mysteries for as long as anyone has been paying attention. But they are a particular kind of mystery, one that sits at the intersection of geology and archaeology and native tradition and institutional history, and that resists the simple kind of explanation that would allow it to be tidied away. The Ozark Hills keep their secrets well. They always have. The landscape itself seems designed for concealment. The hollows and ridgelines and limestone bluffs offering cover and privacy at every scale, from the individual farmstead tucked behind a ridge to the civilization that may have moved for long centuries through the passages beneath the stone. Whatever is down there has survived 10,000 years of human activity on the surface above it. It has survived the arrival of European settlers and the displacement of the people who knew it best. It has survived the surveys and investigations and institutional neglect. It has survived the years and the water and the slow, patient pressure of the earth. It is patient in the way that only old things are patient. It is waiting in the way that only hidden things wait. And sooner or later, if the tools keep improving and curiosity keeps driving the right people into the right caves at the right moments, the ground beneath the Ozarks is going to give up at least part of what it has been keeping. What we do with that, when it happens, will say as much about us as it does about the people who left those smooth walls and level floors and right-angled junctions in the dark beneath the hills. The history we don't know is always more interesting than the history we think we do. And the Ozarks are very old and very patient. And they have a great deal of history they haven't yet been persuaded to tell. Let's take a moment to imagine what it would be like to be there. To stand at the entrance of one of these caves on a cool morning, the mist rising from the spring below, the sound of water over stone, the smell of damp earth and cedar. To duck through the low opening and feel the temperature drop as you leave the surface world behind. To walk deeper into the darkness, your light picking out the irregular shapes of natural cave at first, and then, slowly, the change. The wall straightening, the floor leveling, the feeling that you've crossed a line, that you're no longer in a place that nature made. To run your hand along that smooth surface and feel the faint scratches, the tool marks, the evidence of hands that worked this stone long ago. To stand at a junction where 2 passages meet at a perfect right angle and think about the people who measured that angle, who cut that stone, who walked this same path in the dark by firelight. To wonder what they were thinking, what they were looking for, what they were trying to reach. That's the mystery. That's what's waiting. Somewhere right now, beneath the folded limestone hills of southern Missouri or northern Arkansas, in a passage no one has entered for perhaps 1,000 years, or perhaps 10,000, the silence is absolute. The darkness is complete. The stone walls hold the faint marks of the tools that shaped them, patient as the stone itself, waiting for the light that hasn't yet come. One day it will. And on that day, the story of who we are and who came before us on this continent will be a great deal stranger and a great deal richer than the version we've been taught. That's worth holding on to as the night settles in and the questions quiet down into something that feels almost like an answer. The Ozarks are waiting. They have been waiting for a very long time. Before we close our eyes completely, let's think about Calvin Bray one more time. He grew up in the hills of Ozark County, Arkansas, in the 1940s and 1950s, following his grandfather through the woods and hollows of that country. His grandfather was a man born before the turn of the century in a cabin not far from where Calvin himself was born, a man who had grown up with the hill knowledge that was already old when his own grandfather was young. The kind of knowledge that doesn't get written down because the people who have it don't write things down, and because the knowledge itself resists the written form, being the kind of knowledge that belongs to the land and the relationship between the land and the people who have lived on it for a very long time. Calvin's grandfather knew the caves. He knew which ones were safe to enter and which ones had sections that dropped away into darkness below. And he knew the difference between a natural cave and what he called a made place, a passage or a chamber that had been shaped by human hands rather than by the slow chemistry of water on limestone. Calvin asked him once, when he was about 10 years old, who had made the made places. His grandfather was quiet for a long time, as men of that generation often were when asked a question they considered either too simple or too complex for a quick answer. Then he said that nobody living knew who had made them, and that was probably how the makers had intended it, and that the right relationship to a thing you did not understand was respect and distance rather than investigation. Calvin remembered this his whole life. He never forgot the way his grandfather had said it, not as a prohibition, but as a kind of practical wisdom, the same tone he used when he talked about leaving a bee tree alone unless you were willing to get stung. Calvin eventually left the hills, went to work in a factory in Kansas City, raised a family, retired, but he went back every summer for the rest of his grandfather's life. And when his grandfather died, he kept going back, and he kept paying attention to what the land said in the way that he had learned to pay attention as a child. He never found any of the made places himself. His grandfather had never shown them to him directly, only indicated their general location with a nod or a gesture, enough to know they were there, but not enough to enter them. But he knew they were there. That's the heart of it, isn't it? The knowing without the seeing. The trust that the old ones knew what they were talking about. The patience to wait, to let the land reveal itself in its own time. Calvin Bray is gone now, probably, but his knowing isn't gone. It's in the hills, in the hollows, in the stories that are still told around kitchen tables in the Ozarks on winter evenings when the wind is blowing outside and the fire is warm and the old folks are remembering things they learned from their old folks. That's where the tunnels live, not just in the stone, but in the memory of the people who have always known they were there. The evening light in the Ozark Hills has a particular quality that people who have lived there talk about with something that sounds like longing, even when they're still there. The hills catch the low angle of the sun in late afternoon and hold the light in the hollows and the valleys in a way that makes the landscape seem to glow from within, as if the stone itself were giving off a warmth that the air around it doesn't share. The old-growth cedars on the south-facing bluffs catch the light differently than the oaks and hickories of the north-facing slopes, and the whole landscape becomes a painting of itself for an hour or two before dark. If you were standing on one of the ridge lines in that light, looking out over the miles of forested hills and the bright thread of a river in the valley below, it is possible to feel the weight of the landscape's history in a way that is not usually accessible to the conscious mind. The hills have been there for a very long time, longer than any human history can account for. And the human history that they have witnessed has been long enough and dense enough and eventful enough that the landscape has absorbed it in the way that old places absorb history. Not as a record, but as a presence. The people who built the passages, if they built them, knew this light. They came up from the underground world into this light, at the end of the working day, or at the end of a journey through the plateau, and they stood on the ridge lines the way people stand on ridge lines, and looked out over the landscape that was theirs in the way that a landscape is yours when you have known it for a very long time. They would have recognized the same features are still there, the shapes of the hills and the curves of the river valleys and the places where the springs emerge from the base of the bluffs. The landscape changes over 10,000 years, but it doesn't change so much that the essential geography is unrecognizable. The springs are still there. The rivers still run. The caves are still there. And beneath the hills, in the darkness where the water moves through the limestone, and the passages wait for the light that hasn't come. The work of whoever made those smooth walls and level floors and careful junctions is still there, too. Patient and silent, and waiting for the question to be asked in a way that it can finally be answered. The Ozarks are not done with their story. They have barely begun. There's a particular kind of attention that the Ozark landscape demands from anyone who spends time in it. And that attention is different from the kind of attention that most landscapes ask of us. The hills are not dramatic in the way that the Rockies are dramatic, throwing their height at you and demanding that you look up. They are quiet in their scale, folded and forested, concealing their complexity behind an apparent simplicity that is itself a kind of invitation. The more time you spend in them, the more you see in them, the more the landscape gives up. One hollow at a time, one spring at a time, one bluff face at a time. It is a landscape that rewards patience and punishes hurry. It has always been that way. The people who lived in it for 10,000 years were patient people. And the things they left behind, visible and invisible, above ground and below, are patient things that will wait as long as it takes for someone to look at them with the right kind of attention. This is not a romantic idea. It is a practical one. The investigation of the Ozark tunnels has been held back by impatience as much as by anything else, by the desire for a clean answer to a messy question, by the institutional preference for studies that produce publishable conclusions over investigations that produce more questions than answers, by the human reluctance to sit with genuine uncertainty for as long as genuine uncertainty requires. The landscape itself, if it could offer advice, would probably suggest a different approach. Take your time. Look carefully. Ask the people who have been looking at this longer than you have. Do not assume that the absence of an easy answer means the absence of an answer. One of the things that distinguishes the Ozark tunnel question from other anomalous archaeology stories is the role that water plays in it. Water is central to everything about the Ozark landscape. The springs that emerge from the limestone plateau are not incidental features of the geography. They are the explanation for why people have been living in the Ozarks for 10,000 years. They provide reliable fresh water in a landscape where surface water can be seasonal and unpredictable. They maintain a constant temperature that is cool in summer and warm in winter, making the caves associated with them among the most comfortable microclimates in the region. They create riparian zones along the rivers and streams they feed, zones of exceptional biological productivity that have supported human populations since the beginning of human occupation of the plateau. The water that feeds the springs moves through the rock as a dynamic system, following the fractures and solution channels of the limestone aquifer, rising and falling with the rainfall, taking paths through the rock that have been established over millions of years of geological time. If passages were constructed in the rock, they would have had to navigate this water world, because the rock through which they were cut is not empty. It is full of water, or at least full of paths through which water moves. The construction of dry passages through a water-saturated limestone formation would have required a sophisticated understanding of the aquifer system, an understanding of where the water moved and where it did not, of which fracture zones were active and which were dry, of how to route a passage through the dry sections while avoiding the active water-bearing zones. This is a level of technical knowledge that most people do not associate with pre-Columbian cultures. But it should not be surprising to anyone who has studied the water engineering of indigenous North American civilizations, because the management of water was one of the central technical achievements of those civilizations. The Hohokam of the Sonoran Desert built hundreds of miles of irrigation canals that required a sophisticated understanding of gradient and flow rates, and soil permeability. The ancestral Puebloans of the Colorado Plateau built check dams and water collection systems that could capture and store the limited rainfall of the high desert with extraordinary efficiency. The Mississippian civilizations of the Central River Valleys managed the water resources of the Mississippi and its tributaries in ways that supported dense agricultural populations for centuries. The water knowledge required to route passages through the Ozark aquifer, while considerable, is not qualitatively different from the water knowledge that those other cultures demonstrably possessed. It is different in application, underground rather than above, but not different in the scale of the cognitive and organizational achievement it would represent. The other dimension of the water question is what the tunnels might have provided in terms of water access. Moving through underground passages in a karst landscape, you are never very far from water. The passages are cut through rock that is full of water. Springs emerge from the walls and floors of caves throughout the system. The air in deep karst environments is saturated with humidity that can be extracted by sleeping or resting in them, as the humidity condenses on surfaces exposed to body heat. For people moving long distances through the interior of the continent, reliable water access was a critical logistical concern. The rivers and streams of the surface world provided water, but they were also navigational constraints, defining the routes that surface travel could take. The plateau upland between the river drainages could be crossed only by routes that connected reliable water sources, and in a landscape where surface water could be unreliable in dry seasons. Those routes required knowledge and planning that not everyone possessed. An underground route through the plateau that followed the aquifer system would have had the extraordinary advantage of providing reliable water access throughout its length, independent of surface conditions and surface seasonality. The springs that emerge from the plateau are fed by an aquifer that is recharged over a vast area and that buffers the effects of short-term rainfall variability. Even in a drought year that dries up the smaller surface streams, the springs continue to flow because the aquifer they drain is filled by the accumulated rainfall of a much larger region over a much longer period than any single season represents. A tunnel system routed through the aquifer would have been, in effect, a water-secure route through the heart of the plateau. The people using it would have had reliable water throughout their journey regardless of what was happening on the surface above them. That is a significant tactical and logistical advantage, one that would have had real strategic value for a culture managing a trade or communications network across a large territory. There is a road in southern Missouri that runs through the country south of Eminence, where the current river makes some of its most dramatic bends through the limestone bluffs, and that road in certain seasons feels older than a road has any right to feel. It follows the river drainage through a landscape that has been changing slowly for a very long time. And the bluffs that rise on either side of it show the cross-sections of the geological record. Hundreds of millions of years of marine sediment and reformation and tectonic stress laid out in horizontal bands of gray and tan and rust. If you stop the car and walk up to the base of one of those bluffs and put your hand on the stone, you are touching rock that was laid down when the entire interior of North America was a shallow tropical sea. The fossils of the marine organisms that produced it are visible in the cut face of the bluff. Crinoid stems and brachiopod shells and the occasional spiral of an ancient cephalopod, all compressed into the limestone that was then lifted above sea level and then dissolved by rainwater over hundreds of millions of years into the cave landscape that underlies the region today. The stone under your hand has been many things before it was a bluff in Missouri, and it will be many things after. The human history of this landscape, 10,000 years of it, is a thin recent layer on this vastly older story. The passages that may have been cut through this stone, if they were cut, are among the most recent marks on a surface that has been marked by water and geology for an incomprehensibly longer period. But they are marks made by conscious beings, by people who decided to do something difficult and did it for reasons that mattered to them enough to justify the effort. In the context of the geological time recorded in that bluff face, 10,000 years is nothing. In the context of human meaning, it is everything. The tunnels, if they are there, belong to the human layer of this story. They are the record of human intention and human effort. The evidence that people who lived in this landscape treated it not as something to be observed, but as something to be engaged with, not as a passive backdrop to their lives, but as a material reality that could be shaped and used and connected according to their needs and their understanding of what the landscape offered. That is the most fundamental thing that the tunnel story, if it is true, tells us. Not that there was a lost civilization, not that the pre-Columbian peoples of North America were in contact with Mesoamerica, or with ancient Europe, or with any of the other distant connections that the more dramatic theories propose, but simply that they knew this landscape as intimately as people can know a landscape, and that they engaged with it at a depth that we have not yet fully understood. That is remarkable enough. That is in its way more remarkable than any of the exotic theories, because it is true at a scale that we can verify and in a spirit that we can recognize. The people who built the mounds at Cahokia knew their landscape. The people who built the canals of the Hohokam knew their landscape. The people who managed the springs and rivers and forests of the Ozark Plateau for 10,000 years knew their landscape. We are just beginning to understand how well they knew it and what that knowledge looked like in practice. The tunnels, if they're what the accounts suggest they are part of that understanding. They're part of the full picture of what human life in pre-Columbian North America actually looked like. A picture that is far more complex and far more impressive than the simplified version that has been taught in American schools for most of American history. The river runs clear and cold through the valley below the ridge. It has been running clear and cold through this valley for millions of years, longer than the bluffs that contain it, longer than the springs that feed it, longer than the caves that lie beneath it. The light in the late afternoon catches the surface of the water and breaks it into 1,000 moving pieces of brightness. And the sound of the water moving over the gravel bars carries up the ridge to where you are standing with a clarity that seems to cover the distance faster than it should. Below you, beneath the gravel and the clay and the cobbles of the valley floor, beneath the limestone that underlies all of it, the aquifer is moving. The water that fell as rain on the high plateau to the north weeks or months or years ago is moving through the rock toward the spring that will deliver it to the river. And the river will carry it south and east of the Mississippi, and the Mississippi will carry it to the Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf will put it back into the atmosphere, and the atmosphere will carry it north, and it will fall again on the plateau and begin the journey again. In the rock through which that water moves, in the passages and fractures and solution channels of the limestone aquifer, there may be other passages differently oriented, differently shaped, built rather than dissolved, that have been waiting in the dark for the people who know how to ask the right question about them. The water moves around them and through the joints above them and below them, indifferent to what they are or what they were made for. The stone that surrounds them holds the record of who made them. The way stone holds everything patiently and without judgment. The Ozarks will give up their secrets on their own schedule, not ours. They always have. But the people who are asking the questions are getting better at asking them. The tools are improving. The relationships are being repaired. The understanding is deepening slowly, the way understanding always deepens in the presence of old and patient things. One day, the light will find its way into those passages, and the story they contain will be readable, and the picture of who we were on this continent before the written record begins will be a great deal fuller and stranger and more human than the version we have been living with. That is worth waiting for. The people who built the tunnels, whoever they were, understood the value of patience. They understood that some things take a very long time, and that a thing worth doing is worth doing in the dark, in the cold, by firelight, one careful stroke at a time. We are still learning that lesson, but we are learning it. And the hills are still here, and the springs are still flowing, and the passages are still waiting. That is in the end enough. There is a word in the Osage language, a word that does not translate cleanly into English, that refers to the relationship between a people and the land they have known for a very long time. It is not the word for home, though it includes that meaning. It is not the word for territory, though it includes that meaning too. It is closer to the word for a living relationship, a continuous negotiation between human beings and the landscape they inhabit, a negotiation that is carried on not just in the actions of living people, but in the accumulated knowledge and experience of every generation that has lived in that place before them. The word encodes the idea that a landscape known well enough over a long enough period of time becomes something more than a backdrop to human life. It becomes a participant in that life, something with its own character and its own demands and its own way of responding to the way it is treated. The people of the Ozark Plateau, over 10,000 years of continuous occupation, developed that kind of relationship with their landscape. Not the romanticized version of the relationship between indigenous peoples and nature that popular culture sometimes invokes, which is soft and static and robs the people involved of their full complexity, but the real thing, which is hard and dynamic and full of the ordinary human business of trial and error and accumulated knowledge and practical wisdom and occasional catastrophic mistakes. The kind of relationship that produces the detailed pharmacopoeia of plant knowledge that the bluff dwellers and their predecessors accumulated. The kind of relationship that produces the sophisticated water management that the Mississippian cultures of the region achieved. The kind of relationship that might, if the accounts are correct, have produced a constructed underground network through the heart of the plateau that followed the natural logic of the landscape's own structure and served the needs of a complex and far-reaching cultural world. That is the relationship that was disrupted by European colonization. Not destroyed because the knowledge did not disappear entirely, but disrupted in ways that are still being worked through today, that are still shaping who gets to investigate what and how and under what conditions and toward what ends. The investigation of the Ozark tunnels, when it finally happens in a form that is adequate to the question, will be part of the larger project of repairing that disruption and recovering what can be recovered from the long period of neglect. In the early spring in the Ozark Hills, when the winter is just releasing its hold on the limestone bluffs and the first wildflowers are appearing on the south-facing slopes, while the north-facing hollows still hold patches of old gray snow, there's a moment in the morning when the mist rises out of the hollows and lies in the valleys like something that has been waiting there all winter and is finally waking up. The springs, flowing at their constant temperature through the cold weeks of February and March, steam in the morning air, sending columns of mist up from the hollows where they emerge. And the mist catches the early light and holds it for a few minutes in a way that is genuinely beautiful, in a way that things that have been doing the same thing for a very long time can be beautiful with a depth that newer and more dramatic things cannot match. People have been watching this mist rise from these springs in the early spring morning for 10,000 years. The springs have been producing the mist for much longer than that. The mist does not know it is being watched. It does not know the history of the watchers. It rises and thins and disappears as the morning progresses, regardless of whether anyone is there to see it. And it will keep rising long after the current generation of watchers is gone and has been replaced by whatever comes next. There is something steadying about that. The continuity of the landscape across the disruptions of human history is one of the arguments for paying attention to what the landscape itself remembers. Because the landscape does not forget in the way that institutions forget and individuals forget and oral traditions under sufficient pressure can forget. The springs are still there. The caves are still there. The passages, if they are there, are still there. The evidence that was left in the stone by whoever left it is still in the stone. Time damages organic things. It spalls and erodes surfaces and fills voids with sediment. But stone is patient, and the marks left on stone by deliberate human action can survive a very long time if the stone is not disturbed. The cave environment, with its constant temperature and humidity and its insulation from the frost cycles that crack and erode surface stone, is among the most preservation-friendly environments on Earth. Archaeological materials in deep caves can survive for tens of thousands of years in conditions that would destroy them in a few centuries on the surface. If the wall surfaces in the anomalous passages carry the marks that Moore, Dobbins, and others described, those marks are as fresh today as they were when they were made. They have not been washed away by rain or bleached by sunlight or covered by vegetation. They're sitting in the dark, waiting for someone to come and look at them and read what they say. Someone should go and look at them. There are caves in the Ozark region that local people simply do not talk about. Not because they are dangerous in any obvious way, though some of them may be dangerous in ordinary physical terms, but because they are known to be places with a particular character, places that carry a weight of meaning that is not diminished by the passage of time or the skepticism of modern culture. These are not the caves that are featured in tourism literature or mapped by regional grotto surveys. They are the caves that the grandmothers know about and the old farmers know about, and that have been known about in the same families and the same communities for longer than anyone can clearly remember. The knowledge of these places is not secret in the sense of being actively concealed. It is private in the sense of belonging to people and communities for whom privacy about certain things is a matter of cultural identity rather than conspiratorial behavior. The caves are not marked on any map that the public has access to, not because their location is being hidden, but because no one in the communities that know about them has had reason to put them on a public map, and a fair amount of reason not to. Some of these caves are entrances to the kind of passages that the historical accounts describe. Some of them are not, or at least the people who know about them do not describe them in those terms. Some of them are simply places that the local knowledge recognizes as significant without always being able to articulate clearly why or for what historical reason. The significance is embedded in the knowledge of the place itself, carried in the way that local knowledge is always carried, in association with specific landscape features and specific stories and specific family or community traditions that give the place its meaning. This kind of embedded local knowledge is enormously valuable and enormously difficult to engage with in the context of a formal investigation. It cannot simply be extracted and cataloged. It has to be approached through relationship, through the slow building of trust that allows the people who hold the knowledge to decide whether and how to share it. That is a long process, and it is one that requires the investigators to subordinate their agenda to the priorities of the community, which is not always comfortable for people trained in academic disciplines where the investigator's agenda tends to set the terms of inquiry. But it is the only approach that is both ethically sound and practically effective, because the local knowledge in the context of the Ozark tunnels is not supplementary to the physical investigation. It is its indispensable companion, the interpretive framework without which the physical evidence cannot be understood in its full significance. Let's bring this back to the ground level for a moment, to the specific and the tangible, because it is easy in a story like this to float up into generality and to lose track of the fact that what we are talking about is specific places and specific features and specific evidence that can in principle be examined and analyzed and assessed. There are, by the most conservative count derived from the documented historical accounts, at least 15 cave locations in the Ozark region where anomalous passages or chambers have been reported by multiple independent observers over a period of more than a century. Some of these locations can be identified with reasonable certainty from the descriptions in the accounts. Others are more difficult to place because the accounts are vague about specific location or because the landscape has changed enough in the intervening years to make identification difficult. Of those 15 locations, approximately 8 are in cave systems that are currently accessible, either through publicly accessible cave properties or through privately owned land whose owners might grant research access. The other 7 are in cave systems where access is limited or where the specific passage reported may have been altered or sealed by natural processes since the original observation. 8 accessible locations where the evidence can in principle be examined with modern tools represents a real research opportunity. Not an overwhelming opportunity, but a real one. A systematic examination of those 8 locations using modern surface analysis techniques, ground-penetrating radar, photogrammetry, spectroscopic surface analysis, radiometric dating of appropriate materials, could produce a body of evidence that would either confirm or decisively challenge the hypothesis of artificial construction. The cost of such an investigation would be modest by the standards of archaeological research. The time required would be measured in seasons rather than decades. The technical expertise required exists in the universities of the Ozark region. The community relationships required to conduct the investigation in an ethical and collaborative manner can be built, though they take time and genuine commitment. The only things lacking are the will and the funding, which are the things that are always lacking for investigations of anomalous findings that make the established framework uncomfortable. But the will and the funding can come. They have come for lesser questions. And the Ozark tunnels are not a lesser question. They are one of the genuine mysteries of American prehistory. One of the places where the official story has a gap that is large enough and specific enough to demand serious attention. One of the most extraordinary things about the Ozark Plateau as a landscape is the degree to which it has remained, despite 2 centuries of American settlement and resource extraction, genuinely wild in its interior. The national forests and the national scenic riverways and the state parks have preserved large sections of the plateau in something approaching their pre-settlement condition, and the rural character of the human settlement in the surrounding areas has limited the kind of intensive development that has transformed other parts of the American interior. The caves have not been dynamited for fill. The springs have not been dammed into irrelevance. The bluffs have not been quarried away. This is good news for the investigation of the tunnels, because it means that the physical evidence, where it exists, has a reasonable chance of still being intact. A landscape that has been intensively quarried or developed would have destroyed many of the cave systems along with whatever they contained. The relative preservation of the Ozark landscape, a preservation that is partly the result of its remoteness and partly the result of deliberate conservation decisions made over the past century, means that the window of investigation is still open. It will not be open forever. The pressures of development and resource extraction that have been held off by conservation protections are real and persistent, and the political will to maintain those protections is not guaranteed. Every decade that passes without the investigation being conducted is a decade in which the risk of irreversible damage to the evidence increases. This is not an argument for rushing, because a rushed investigation that is poorly designed and inadequately resourced and conducted without the necessary community relationships would do more harm than good. But it is an argument for urgency of a thoughtful kind, for moving the investigation from the category of things that might eventually be done to the category of things that are being actively prepared for. The stone is patient. The people who care about this question need to be patient too, but patient in the active sense, patient in the way of someone who is doing the preparation work while they wait for the conditions that will allow the investigation to proceed. There's a last thing to say about the tunnels, and it is perhaps the most important thing, and it is this. Whether the passages are constructed or natural, whether they were made by people or by water, they are part of a landscape that has sustained human life and human culture for 10,000 years. The people who lived in that landscape left traces of themselves in it, above ground and below. And those traces are the material record of who they were and how they understood the world and what they valued and how they treated the land and each other. That record belongs in the deepest sense to everyone who has ever lived in that landscape and to the descendants of those people. And it deserves to be treated with the care and the seriousness that it has too often been denied. The story of the Ozark tunnels is a small part of a much larger story about who lived in North America before European contact and what their lives and their cultures looked like. That larger story is one that American culture has been slowly, imperfectly, and painfully working to understand more fully and more honestly for the past several decades. The tunnels, if they're what the account suggests they are a piece of that larger story. A piece that has been sitting in the dark waiting for the question to be asked properly. When it is asked properly, it will contribute to the larger understanding in ways that cannot yet be anticipated, because that is the nature of genuine discoveries. They change the framework in ways that could not have been predicted from within the old framework. The Ozarks are ready. The question is ready. The tools are nearly ready. And the relationships are being built that will allow the investigation to proceed in the way it deserves to proceed. The tunnels are waiting. The story is not finished. It has barely begun. The hills fold into each other in the last light of the day, and the river below catches the color of the sky and holds it for a few minutes before the dark comes down. Somewhere in the limestone beneath all of it, in the deep quiet where no light has reached for a very long time, the passages are exactly as they were, smooth-walled and level-floored, keeping their silence in the way that old things keep silence. not from secrecy, but from patience. The world above them has changed many times. They have not changed. They are waiting for the question that will finally be asked in a way they can answer. And when that question comes, when the light finally enters those passages and the tools finally read what the walls have been saying all along, the story that comes out of them will be stranger and more human and more beautiful than anything we have yet imagined. The Ozarks always were that kind of place. They always will be. Good night, sweet dreams.